July 27th, 2010. We're with John Sutherland at Manchester Community College. John, when did you get hired at the college?
1970. I came for my interview, I remember very well, either the day before, the day of, or the day after the invasion of Cambodia. And as a matter of fact, I was asked to come up and give a talk at the inauguration of the president, and it was almost to the day of my interview, because obviously I can associate with that because Kent State soon followed. And so I came to work in September of 1970.
Now, if recollection serves, it was that spring of 1970, when the National Guard killed 4 students at Kent State?
That's what I'm talking about,
right.
yeah.
So was the campus closed down or on strike?
Well, Kent State had not yet happened.
Okay.
The Cambodian invasion, which set it off, happened. And there was a small demonstration that day, and I'm going to say 15 or fewer students out in front of the Hartford Road building, but nothing big. However, after my interview and after Kent State, I understand, because I wasn't here, that yes, there was a large protest to the extent that the faculty were authorized to permit students to take, I guess, the final day off from school in a state of protest. I'll give a funny sidelight, a humorous sidelight to that. Obviously, this was supposed to have been a day of sit-ins and education. I've been told by people that the Connecticut beaches were a little more crowded that day than otherwise. But I was not here for that.
Do you remember who interviewed you?
Oh, very, very clearly. Well, let me preface this. My interview was a little bit unique, and it was probably true for some of the other people who were hired that year. I was interviewed a week or two after Fred Lowe had a serious heart attack. I never met Fred Lowe until I was on the payroll in September. Therefore, I got an impression of this school, and it was an impression that this was a school where the faculty had an awful lot of autonomy, because I remember going into were you here when we were in the Hartford Road building? Okay. You know, you entered the front door and administrative offices were directly to the left. And I went in, announced myself, and sat. They said, have a seat. And in strode a few minutes later this very distinguished-looking gentleman with a huge shock of white hair, a white goatee, a blazer, and a bow tie, and it was David Gidman, who would be my department chair. All business. Took me down for a cup of coffee, and then it was a whirlwind. They had me from 9 o'clock till I staggered out around 3 or 3:30 p.m. And David and Jim Tatro, who would be my division director, were the only people in authority that I met, except for about 10 minutes in Bob Fenn's office, which was really pro forma. The dean of faculty, they took me in, introduced me, shook my hand, asked me a few pro forma questions, and that was it. And this is one of the things that impressed me. I thought, boy, this is a faculty-governed institution. Well, when I got here in September, it became clear that it wasn't quite that. It had very strong faculty, many with strong leadership qualities, but it was at that time that Bob Fenn, who I later came to get along with very well, but at that time was introducing the concept of goals and objectives, with the enthusiasm of somebody who has just opened up an Egyptian pharaoh's mine, his tomb. And it was assumed the faculty would be equally gaga about this, and it made for an interesting first year here. And I realized you did not get an accurate picture, John, when you came for your interview. And in fact, it was that activity that ultimately led to the formation of what became the statewide union. Manchester was a leader in that, and people like Bill Dowd and Sid Lipshires can tell you a lot more about it. But I was taken around. I sat in classrooms. They made a deliberate effort for one day to integrate me into the institution so that they would not only know something about me, but I would know something about them. And I've not asked any of them, my God, you did this with all the people who, because it was quite an effort, and I was very impressed. They took me to lunch at Willie's Steakhouse, and we were in one of those, not the main part of the restaurant, but in back, a room that has all windows on the wall. And it was noontime, and the noontime sun came right through those windows. I later learned that Sid Lipshire deliberately had me placed facing the windows so that I could not observe their faces, but they could observe mine. And I learned that after I had been hired. But it was basically the history people, Dave Gidman, Mary Ann Handley, Pat Howland, who left, I think, quite a time before you were there, and Jim Tatro, who was both division director and a member of the history department, and two other people, Eleanor Coltman and Tom Lewis. And the reason they played a role was that I was hired and remained for the rest of my career on a partial release time to direct something called the Institute of Local History, which at the time I had no idea what I was being hired for. And you mentioned the oral history, that was a part of it. And Tom Lewis and Eleanor Coltman, along with Fred Lowe, were very instrumental in organizing that program. So those people really wore me out that day, but it was a very positive. I remember leaving, and you have to understand, here's what I saw in terms of brick and mortar. I saw this old Cheney office building, this brick building, that it had, I think, minimal updating in order to accommodate its new use. I saw old trailers in the back of that building. I was told that you taught at high school at night as well as in the middle school. I was told my office, if I was hired, would be in the building that was at the top of Spruce Street on Center Street, where Bob Fenn had his office downstairs and where junior faculty had their offices in the attic. And I got through that day and told my wife, I really would like to go to work here. So first impressions are everything, and the brick and mortar impressions were very minor. Now, of course, I knew that a new campus was about to open up in another year. But I thought that was an interview process that maybe, and I want to be awfully careful here, because I think we have improved in terms of equity by having good affirmative action rules. But I hope we haven't lost the genuine informality of the interview process that I went through. I interviewed several other places, and I didn't get that. So anyway, that was a long way around
When you began, the Vietnam War was, well, let's say, opposition was increasing dramatically.
Yeah.
Did you see, what was the student population, the student body like in 1970 and 71?
Well, I'll tell you my impressions of what they were like and how that relates to, because you're asking about student activism. There were a lot of young people right out of high school, and there were a lot of what I then called middle-aged people my age, 32 or older, up to 40, 45. My impression, and I think others would substantiate this, that there was more activism among the faculty than there was among the student body. There was student activism, but some of these were young people who were in a situation that they had not had the preparation that their peers had. They hadn't been in college preparatory courses. Some had, but many had not. Or they were returning students who were very serious about their own personal future. And I think all that is very understandable. So I myself had come to the conclusion that I thought this was a mistake. And I didn't play any leadership role, but I went to meetings, and like many of us did. And that's my impression, that the intensity among the faculty was greater than among the student body here. If you compare it to, say, the student body at UConn, and even more so at Little Ivy, Trinity, and Wesleyan, and so forth.
A moment ago, you mentioned your involvement with the Institute for Local History. Can you elaborate on what you did?
Yeah. This is Fred Lowe. This personal story is Fred Lowe. Here I am in his office, and by the way, again, speaking of brick and mortar, there is, I think it's now in the Historic Register on Keeney Street, the old Keeney Street School. It's a, wooden building, and that's where Fred's office was. And I don't remember exactly when or who took me there, but it was essential that I, as soon as possible, be interviewed by the president. Of course, at large institutions, there are faculty who never meet the president, but back then at this time, when you were being considered, you met the president. I served on search committees right through Jonathan's era, and the last one being for our division director in the 90s, and every interviewee met Jonathan. So I had not. So someone took me up to the office. And I went in, sat down, and Fred went through the usual pleasantries, and then I started asking Fred questions. And I said, now, what are your expectations for the Institute of Local History? And he grinned and said, I was just about to ask you that. And that impressed me right away. And so I told him that I came up here with a concern that this not be another layer of the local historical society, that we not compete with them. In fact, that we immediately establish liaison with them for cooperative ventures. And so I had come up here, well, let me backtrack. I had gone through the PhD program at Temple University, and for my dissertation, I had done a lot of oral history before I knew what oral history was, because it was a modern topic. When I came for my interview, you could not drive down Hartford Road without knowing something used to go on here, all those damn buildings, those mill buildings. And so I knew about the Cheney Mills, and I did a little background work over the summer. So I determined, I think we ought to have an oral history project with the mill workers there. and we ought to tie this into the academic program by, at least in my class, having students opt instead of a paper for doing an oral history project on a volunteer basis. So that was one thing we did. It was on again, off again the whole time. I never got beyond, I started out at 1/4 release time a semester, 3 courses, and when during the Mescal recession in the 70s, that got back to 1/4 release time a year, and it never returned to so one semester I taught 12 hours, other semester I taught 9 hours. So it was sporadic, but we got toward 100 interviews. We were around 75, 80 interviews, I think, when I left. The other thing was non-credit courses. And so we ran non-credit courses in topics like, for the local historical societies, we ran a guest speaker course called Techniques of Local History, where we would have someone who understood about archive preservation come in, someone who understood about local historical societies and their relationship to the community. Video was becoming a very, very big thing. Then when it was becoming apparent you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And so Disney has since come to historical societies and museums, and we did that. We had a course in Connecticut history we ran more than once. Tom Lewis taught a course on Connecticut geography. Eleanor Coltman and I did a course on Connecticut government. I did an industrial history of Connecticut course, an immigration course. So that. Then there were special projects, and John often came in here. I did a Cheney workers slideshow that John and Hugh Edmondson helped me a great. It was produced in not this building, but it was produced in John and Hugh's office, and I just don't know how many times I gave that. Right through to when I left in 2001, but I ate more chicken a la king at service club luncheons, and I got somehow for about 5 years I got on a high school reunion thing. I think it started out, believe it or not, with a class of 25 or 26, and they passed it. So every year I would go to the next class, and we did a lot with teachers. I got a small grant once where I actually did a summer course specifically for teachers on local history, and then we went in, Tom and I particularly went into elementary school classrooms. At some point, someone on the Board of Ed or somewhere in their wisdom decided that the 3rd grade would be the best time for students to study local history. So this was state law. And so I spent a lot of time in 3rd grades. And I also went into U.S. history classes in the high school when they would talk about the Industrial Revolution, and I would bring Cheney Brothers in there. The perhaps longest running thing was the annual walking tour of the Cheney district, which I did from 76 to 06. Tom Lewis and I did it. Therefore, for the last 3 or 4 years, I was coming down from Maine. And finally, in 06, I went to Chris Palin and said, I think it's time. Not only that, I thought I was getting stale. And I'm just delighted that Chris is continuing this. So it has now been going on for 34 years. If Chris has another good 15 to 20 years ahead of him, that'll be... So these are... I'm running out of... there were other things, but it was very much what I wanted, at least, to be putting the community in the community college. It was a community service function.
You were associated with the college for more than 30 years.
Yeah, 25 full-time, 5 part-time.
So what changes did you see over that time period?
Well, obviously size. I would never. I was walking in from parking lot B today, and I'm still stunned. And I have very ambiguous feelings when I drive by what used to be the lower campus. Quite frankly, I'm glad on balance that they tore those buildings down because they were so pathetic looking after they weren't used. And I'm glad to see what looks like a park is, and I very much hope that a plaque goes down there because in fact, you guys are still here. If you want to spread the word to whoever would be doing that. But it should not be forgotten, and it will be forgotten.
I walked that campus for the first time in early spring and was very depressed.
Yeah.
To realize that 25 years of my professional career has evaporated.
Yeah.
And maybe archaeologists can find a few broken bottles.
Yeah, and that's the same with. I came up to Low for about a year or two, and then asked to go back, and remain back there. But I really do hope that a plaque goes up down there. So size, but that's brick and mortar. The faculty increased very, very considerably. And the offerings increased very considerably. The student body, while when I came here it had that return to school group, aged. I think the data is there, but I think the average age got up as far as somewhere between 26 and 28. I'm not sure. That was particularly reflected in the evening classes. And although all of us felt a tug between, after all, family responsibilities and our career, evening classes were a lot more diversified and a lot more exciting, I think. You would have people in there all the way from people who had their filling station coveralls on to people with the tie and, of course, the pink collar cohort, which was really one of the largest cohorts of the back-to-school program. But the reputation changed. I remember meeting people and getting inwardly incensed and reminding myself this is not going to be a good people-to-people thing if you start sounding off. But things like, well, it's different, isn't it? I mean, you get the dregs. Really, people who were, I've got to say, brutally honest, they did not mince words. And I would try to explain, well, we look at it a little differently. And I did particularly from, if you got the time, can I give you a 2-minute background here? I graduated from high school in 1955 in Maine and had a high school record for a variety of reasons that an admission officer 5 years later at the University of Maine referred to as resembling a comic strip. There was no question of college for me. I went in the Navy, spent 5 years in the Navy, and then I applied at Orono at the University of Maine. And I found out that they sent out not 2 letters in those years, they sent 3. You either got an acceptance letter, or you got a rejection letter, or you got what I call a we should talk letter. And that's what I got. And I drove up to Orono, and this guy is behind the desk, and he shook my hand and said, sit down. And he said, I owe you a debt of gratitude. And I said, why? And he said, because usually I get one belly laugh in the morning when I read the comic strips, but I came into the office and read your high school transcript and got another one. Now, that guy would get fired for that kind of behavior. It did not offend me in the least. And he took me on. He gave me a chance. Why? Maybe he had a conquest the night before. I don't know. And I realized how arbitrary getting into college was for a great mass of people who might have some potential but didn't show it. And it was one of the things I thought of. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine had a father who was president of Philadelphia Community College, and I had talked with him a few times, but it was always in the back of my mind here that here is an opportunity for people to have a second chance, and a lot of them take that chance and they make it, and a lot of them don't, and that's okay. I've always argued that if you get rid of open admission at the community college, then all you're going to have is another layer of higher ed. And if you want cost effectiveness, don't look for it. But over the long haul, I think in outcomes, it's very effective. And of course, second, those are not the only people we service. That great mass of people who have been out of school for 10, 15, 20 years. It took a long time before I could say I was older than a lot of my students. And I think something that was a thrill to me in my first semester and my last, I never got over it. You could bank on it the first day of class. You've been there. And someone, usually a woman, comes up and in effect says, "I'm very nervous. I know I'm going to fail." And I got to the point, I think, where I was almost blasé. I would think to myself, yeah. And of course, they do not fail, and many times they're A students. They're very often B students, and they do very well. And we saw more and more of them as the average age got older. We've all been there. I have a student who has been the chair of the English department at two different high schools not just me, other people. I remember this one fondly because, this is all right if she had an enormous tragedy in her family that no mother should have, and was about ready to drop out of school. And Mike DeRamo and I persuaded her to come back in the spring for a class, and later she re-entered full-time, got her BA and MA from UConn, and we all have those stories. And those are great community college stories. Anyway, you asked me about change.
You handled it nobly. We have time for one more question, and the question is, imagine that you were sitting down and talking to someone who had just gotten hired to begin their teaching career at Manchester Community College next month. What advice would you give to that person?
Particularly if they had just come out of graduate programs and had not taught before, or if they had been teaching assistants in major universities, I would advise them, keep your expectations realistic. You are going to have a lot of students who aren't quite certain what they are going to do when they enter the classroom. Don't plan on getting into subject matter the first day of class, and perhaps even later. Students have every right to be told that they should bring notebooks to class, and they have every right to be told, is this going to be a lecture class? Is this going to be a seminar-type class? Is it going to be a mix of lecture discussion? And what are your responsibilities? Don't tell them there are going to be 3 exams. Tell them what kind of exams they are going to be. If there are going to be papers, for many students, you're going to have to explain to them basic research techniques. I was very conscious of this because I was in the non-college preparatory program in high school, and I had none of this preparation. I just became more reinforced when my daughter got in high school and was in the college prep program at Rockville High. And I saw her coming home finally after her senior year, and I said, my God, everything she had that I didn't have, and that a good many of those entering out of high school have not had, or those returning have forgotten. And I think because, again, first impressions are so important. I would tell a student it wouldn't do any harm to be at the door of the room, the open door of the room, 10 minutes or 15 minutes before class, with your class outlines in your hand, individually shaking the hand of each student who comes in the room and handing him the course outline. Because you've got a lot of uncertain people coming in who didn't have the kind of education that you had. On the other hand, and I guess I'll conclude with this, I would say they deserve the kind of education you had. And if I can just go back to my interview with David when I came here, David Gidman, we were having coffee. It was at a break. And it was obvious he began pumping me as to what I knew about the community college. In fact, he was kind of asking me the question you just asked me. And I was asking him questions. And at some point he said, you have to remember, David was Wesleyan and Columbia. And at some point David said, I've never forgotten this. I think it is the remark made the longest ago that I'm almost certain I'm quoting, that I can remember. He said, if community colleges are really going to democratize higher ed, then we have got to make certain our students get as good an education as you and I received. And I've never forgotten that. I think it led David to be very severe and may have caused him to have some students drop out. But any of us in the history department can tell you, those of us who got some of David's students a year after he had them, oh my God. I taught part-time at UConn, Eastern, and Central, and I had students as good or better than any of them at MCC, some of whom were David's students. So I would say, on the one hand, get your expectations realistic, but don't water down what you're doing, because, and I think we've been pretty good at that, as our transferees have shown us.
Wonderful. I mean, really, very articulate.
Oh.
And organized.
Oh.
Well done. Thank you.
Well, thank you.